And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. This is Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. And you can find us at America's Voice News. And also, if you're listening to us at the Ricochet Audio Network, got some questions coming up today from Ricochet members. And you can also find our video series at YouTube and all of your favorite podcast applications, iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. We're delighted today to have returning to Whiskey Politics, the great Ken Starr, and he just told me, don't call me Kenneth. Ken Starr, obviously everybody knows who you are, the former Solicitor General, Dean at Pepperdine and Baylor University. Thank you for joining us again, sir.
My great pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
Last time we met, we were just reminiscing a little bit. It was a couple of years ago on the Weekly Standard Cruise, or the formerly known as the Weekly Standard Cruise. It's a pleasure to have you back again. And a lot has happened in the past 2 years. First of all, a brand new book that you have called Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Last time we spoke, it was right after the election, and I asked you, I said to you, did anything happen in the 1990s, number one? But number two, if whatever happened in the 1990s with the Whitewater investigations that led to the Lewinsky investigation and ultimately the House impeaching President Clinton, how much of that impact do you think led to a factor in the last election, 2016? I think you replied with the word, it may have had an impact on trust. It's now been 2 years. You've written a book, and I want to get into the book with you. In retrospect, in the last 2 years, would you change that answer at all?
Well, I think I would amend it and reflect a little bit more on it. But I think what the nation went through in the 1990s was quite wrenching. It sort of sucked all the air out of the room. And I fear that the same thing may be happening now, or that we're in the early stages of that happening. I saw a report to the effect that 17 investigations underway. So I think one of the huge differences is there's likely to be less attention on what Bob Mueller does. I'm obviously behind the veil of ignorance, and increasing attention to what the House of Representatives does. So we'll see. I think one of the great unanswered questions is, will Bob Mueller accede to the president's determination to go no further in interviews or what have you with him? Now, here is an enormous difference. The independent counsel statute in which I was appointed and operated had this kind of nudge and dynamic toward impeachment. Not so with the Mueller probe. The Mueller probe is a probe by the Justice Department for the Justice Department. He's just brought in from the outside, but he's now inside the Justice Department, and he is going to be reporting to, he now reports to the acting Attorney General, but hopefully Bill Barr, who's a superb candidate nominee, will be confirmed. He is going to be reporting to the Attorney General of the United States. I didn't have that relationship, you see. Rather, my reporting was to the House of Representatives, which was one of the many defects, I think, of the old independent counsel statute. It was, as Antonin Scalia so memorably put it, in his dissenting opinion in the case that upheld the constitutionality of that statute, that this statute is acrid with the smell of impeachment. Pretty strong language, but it's very true. And so remember that the 1978 statute was enacted in the wake of Watergate. And it was a congressional tool, it being the independent counsel statute, that was aimed at the presidency. Aimed at the presidency. What was the politics of that? Anti-Republican politics, for one thing. Now, not that Republicans weren't supporting it at the time because of the Watergate aftermath and so forth. So I think as we reflect on the 90s and so forth, the action now is going to, I think, shift away from Bob Mueller in contrast to what does the Starr report say, and more to what do the House Democrats intend to do. By the way, I see, Dave, that Karl Rove, who's a pretty astute observer, predicts that the House of Representatives, one of his predictions for 2019 is that the House of Representatives will actually impeach President Trump. I hope and pray that that's not so, because the nation will, as I've said in my book, the nation will be put through hell if we do that, just as we saw in the 1990s.
You know, your book, and it's a great book, you refer to impeachment as hell. I think those were the words. I'm paraphrasing maybe, but you talk about how Johnson went through, he survived, Clinton survived. And you point to a suggestion in the way that you write this is suggesting that wouldn't politically the Democrats be more beneficial by censuring Trump and having an injured president as opposed to going through an impeachment process, which is highly unlikely to go through the Senate?
Exactly. I think some of the Democrats in the House, the newly elected Democrats, campaigned on a platform of impeachment, among other things. You know, there are all the economic issues and Bernie Sanders' vision of democratic socialism and all that. But on the just pure partisan side, I was surprised that so many new members had said to their constituents, I'm going to vote for impeachment. Now, that's terrible because they didn't have the benefit of all the evidence and the deliberative process and so forth. You shouldn't go into the House of Representatives saying, I'm pledged to vote in a particular way. Think of a jury. Right? I know I'm going to vote guilty or not guilty before, just based on what I've been reading in the newspapers. It's a terrible form of governance. But here's the fundamental flaw. The founding generation was essentially telling the nation impeachment is an extreme remedy, and it is reserved for the most extravagantly demanding circumstances. And we know now from Bill Clinton that there was no dispute. He committed crimes, crimes of perjury and obstruction of justice. The name of the book, Dave, comes from the fact that Bill Clinton was held in contempt by a United States District Court judge, the chief judge in Little Rock, Arkansas. She found him in contempt. And what was the basis of her finding him in contempt? Because he had committed obstruction of justice. That starts sounding like Richard Nixon, right? But there just was not enough of a nexus or connection with the conduct of the presidency itself in the minds of the American people and ultimately the United States Senate. That's why I think that the Clinton years, as I go through this analysis and my memoir, it's my perspective on this, should be viewed as a warning signal to Democrats. Just don't go there. You're going to be putting the nation through hell if you can find an alternative. And I think that what was underway is exactly that, a resolution of censure. And there were some debates about it. Maybe we can talk about that. A resolution of censure. We're not going to let you get off scot-free, Mr. President, because it is terrible what you did. And we don't want to be seen as the United States Senate as just saying, oh, what you did is A-OK. And I hope that's not the message or the enduring lesson. But the fundamental lesson is, unless you have a national consensus the president needs to go and to disrupt an election, then don't file those articles of impeachment to begin with. In the last minute here before the break, a quick question for you on this. If the Mueller report finds proof of collusion or, obstruction of justice, should the president be impeached? If he finds that, then that needs to be contested, right? The advantage that I had, so to speak, is the facts were not contested. I think there may very well be a very lively dispute as to whether, even if Bob Mueller finds that. But I would say you're moving into that territory that would cause reasonable people to say, we've at least got to talk about it. Okay. Well, we're going to be right back here with Ken Starr, and we're going to be talking a lot about this, Mueller, and some other issues as well, what's going on in our culture since the last couple of years, and we're delighted to be here with you, Ken. So we'll be right back after the break. I'm Dave Sussman, and again, we're here at Whiskey Politics. And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. Dave Sussman here with you. And we are speaking with Ken Starr about his new book, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation.
You know, as the report finalizes right now, we're talking a lot about the politics of it all, which may lead to impeachment, censure as well. With your perspective, with your background, I mean, you went through the ringer with this thing, and I want to talk a little bit more about, you know, how you were involved with this, obviously starting with the Whitewater investigation. You were ready to move on to Pepperdine, and was it Janet Reno that pulled you back in kicking and screaming?
Yes. Well, I can't say I was kicking and screaming, but yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Janet Reno, but go right ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think a lot of people, and, you know, a lot of people weren't even around maybe listening to this show today in the 90s, at least in a conscious aspect of what was going on. But you didn't start out the Whitewater investigation with any kind of idea that it would actually end up with a Lewinsky situation, did you?
No, not in my wildest dreams or nightmares, I guess I should say. In fact, when the information about the president's perjury, Monica's perjury, potential obstruction of justice came in to us, and I'm so glad you mentioned Pepperdine, which I love, I had postponed my departure from the investigation. I was ready to turn it over to someone else, and I'd go into this in the book. I wasn't leaving the front line, so to speak. I was simply saying it's time for a change in command. And so off I would be going to Pepperdine University. Then this information comes in. And Dave, one of the frustrations to me that continues to this very day in some of the looking back and reminiscing about what happened 20 years ago is that the Lewinsky phase of our investigation was specifically authorized by Janet Reno, Bill Clinton's Attorney General. She did the right thing. She looked at the evidence that we had, the Lewinsky tapes, the Linda Tripp tapes, the information then that we secured during our effort to get Monica to cooperate with us. And we took all that evidence promptly to the Attorney General. We didn't sit on it. And she didn't sit on it either. She brought her advisors around. And some of those advisors were very respected career prosecutors. And she made the determination right away, the Lewinsky phase has to be investigated. The president may have committed serious crimes. I think the American people just, at the time, did not understand that. Failure of communication in that respect, failure of understanding. And so it was very important, I think, now that we look back on this and with that benefit of 20 years of hindsight, if I could, quote, do it all over again, I would have been saying every single day, and I didn't, this investigation was authorized by Janet Reno. If you have an objection to the investigation, then go ask her, why did you authorize this? Now, I don't mean to be unkind. I mean, she's departed from this life, and I had plenty of squabbles with her. But on this, I think she did what she needed to do under the law because the president was involved in this effort to impede the rule of law and the justice system by preventing Paula Corbin Jones from carrying on in a lawful way to which she was entitled as an American citizen, her lawsuit in federal district court alleging what? Sexual harassment in the workplace.
Right.
Sometimes we forget that Paula Corbin Jones was not someone who he ran into at a fundraiser. She was an employee of Arkansas, and he first encountered her at an official event of the government of Arkansas. So we're talking about the world of sexual harassment, Me Too, and all that here was a workplace activity that entitled her to her day in court, and the president was determined not to give her her fair trial.
As you're talking about Janet Reno, you know, I'm obviously sitting here and I'm thinking about the fact that Sessions was the one that appointed Mueller for this. And if you were to have any advice or suggestions to Robert Mueller at this stage, you know, the report can come out in a week, it can come out in 6 months, we don't know. What would that be? It
would be, please act with absolute integrity, be very respectful of the presidency as an office, but then tell the truth. And politics has to be left at the door. As we all know, there have been expressions of concern, and I've expressed concern about some of the people around Bob Mueller in terms of their political proclivities and activities and so forth. They have a First Amendment right to do that, but I think it puts a special burden on Bob Mueller to make sure that these judgments, whatever they are completely honest, and they're above politics, not informed by politics. Now, at every turn, a president, regardless of political party, has nothing to do with what party you're in, is going to be yelling something such as witch hunt, right? And the very first special counsel ever appointed in American history by Ulysses S. Grant was then fired by Ulysses S. Grant for going too far. Right? Then we remember, some of us lived through it, others just know from history, the infamous Saturday Night Massacre. Well, what was the massacre? It was the firing, the ordering by Richard Nixon of the firing of Archibald Cox. But I'm so thankful that the president has not, notwithstanding the language that he's used very strong language and very frequently condemned the investigation as a witch hunt, but he hasn't exercised his authority, which is to direct the firing. So thank goodness for that, because the country would have, I think, once again been put through hell. Last question before our second break here. The Clinton investigation happened in the 1990s. It was the dawn of the internet. It was the dawn, really, of cable news. MSNBC and Fox were just startups at the time. What would the difference be today if the Clinton investigation happened under you with the media, in your mind? I think that the president would have resigned pretty early on. Yes, once it became true. I mean, that's one person's opinion, but that opinion is buttressed by people in the media at the time. ABC's Sam Donaldson, who at the time was the senior White House reporter, and he's still around. And Sam Donaldson on television said, if these allegations are true, then the president will not last for 2 weeks. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Now, that was before the whole MeToo movement and the folks in the front office, so to speak, the powerful CEOs who did not treat, the allegations are that they did not treat women in their employ with dignity and respect, but did exactly the opposite of that. Well, this was, let's face it, this was a consensual relationship, but it nonetheless was a power relationship, right? Also involving the president, the CEO, with a very young woman, and that's just another part of the dynamic that I think people would have said this is just utterly unacceptable in light of the fact that the president had essentially, I think, had a moral bargain with the American people beginning in January of the presidential campaign. When he was still seeking the nomination, and I'm going back to 1992, when he essentially said, "I've hurt my family," and it's as if he didn't say that I'll never do it again. He was much too skillful for that, but I think that was sort of the understanding that he was going to turn over a new leaf, so to speak, in the way he conducted himself, which was pretty well known in Arkansas. You know, you touch upon a couple of issues I want to bring up after the break here, and that is the Me Too movement and how culture has changed. And the Clintons are very much still a part of that conversation today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about SCOTUS and some ricochet questions coming up right after the break here. And, oh, real quickly, the book, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Where can people find it? Yes, wherever books are sold. Okay. And so Jeff Bezos still has a number of copies that he'll send out. I think he might get half of those copies in a few months left. We'll be right back with Ken Starr, Whiskey Politics. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics on America's Voice News, and coming up with a couple of Ricochet member questions for Ken Starr. But before we get to that, in the book, you refer to Monica Lewinsky, and
You said that her mother suggested that she cooperate with the investigation, and you said that she really kind of pushed back against that because of her love for the president. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that really plays into a lot about what we see today with the Me Too movement and the abuse of power in those situations.
Right. Yes, what unfolded when we had the Linda Tripp tapes, and then we had the benefit of live conversation between Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky, which all confirmed the fact that Monica had committed perjury and was encouraging Linda Tripp to do exactly the same by filing a false affidavit. We then invite her and escort her to this gathering in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So it wasn't unpleasant circumstances. The circumstances were unpleasant, but the venue was very, very good. And so we gave her the opportunity to come forward and cooperate with us. She was very emotional, understandably, but she wanted to consult with her family. And her mother then, who was living in New York, comes down by train. So our career prosecutors and FBI agents just stood by and so forth. And so the mom comes, and Mrs. Lewis encourages, and we heard this, it was in the hallway because it was a very loud conversation, but in the hotel, encourages Monica to cooperate because we had offered her immunity for her truthful testimony and her full and complete cooperation. And Monica responded with very colorful, vulgar language, "I'm not going to bring this president down." And I think that was informed not simply by political loyalty, but by her personal, deep affection for the President of the United States. So she was bold and courageous. I thought, as I describe in the book, I go into some detail, she very successfully manipulated us, kept us cooling our heels for hours on end, when I think she had absolutely no intention whatsoever of cooperating with the investigation. And that sort of sealed the fate, so to speak, for the whole nation for the next 4 or 5 months, because we were unable to break down those barriers, to tear down the wall, so to speak,
right,
of enmity that developed until finally, to get a little bit ahead of the story, but as you know, in the fullness of time, the family fired their family lawyer who was representing Monica and was not doing a good job, to put it mildly. And they then brought in 2 very experienced criminal defense lawyers, both of whom I happen to know. They were 2 of the leading criminal defense lawyers in the Washington, D.C. area. And within a very short time, we had a deal. We had a deal with Monica, who, to her credit, from that point on, was completely transparent. She was completely honest. And the rest then is all history, because she confirmed that which we felt that we knew from her on confession, so to speak, to Linda Tripp, both in the tapes and then also in her one-on-one at one of the restaurants near the Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City.
What would you think the media and the culture and the whole zeitgeist today of Me Too, how would that react to Monica Lewinsky in 2019? Yeah,
because she wasn't a complainant, right? So now the Me Too is what's the triggering event? Someone says, I was mistreated,
right,
and my dignity was violated, and perhaps worse, by this person in power, this man in power. So it's a little bit different, but I think what it is, we're just much more sensitive to the idea of men in particular. Obviously, it can go both ways, but the classic cases, the powerful man in the front office, the CEO, is taking advantage of his power, right, with respect to a woman who is relatively powerless. So it's not the same thing, but it's the dynamic of a workplace engagement that then is going to, I think, raise very serious questions in the minds of people, especially because you're talking about the President of the United States, and a higher standard of conduct is expected, and so forth. So it's not precisely the same, but I think the culture has shifted in terms of sensitivity to the conduct of powerful men in the workplace in a really remarkable way.
Gotcha. Got a few questions here from some Ricochet members. Want to throw those at you. One is from Richard Easton. Andrew McCarthy says that the appointment of Mueller violated Justice Department guidelines since no crime was specified and detailed instructions were not immediately given to him. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think Andy is making a good point, but I think there's another side to that because the appointment document of May 17, 2017 by Rod Rosenstein actually identifies the issue of what we call collusion, but it also points specifically and expressly to Jim Comey's testimony in Congress in March, so 2 months before. If you go to that testimony, you see that an investigation was in fact underway, including possible crimes. So as we say in the law, there's sort of an incorporation by reference. I think obviously the document could have been drafted much more carefully and cautiously, but it was, as I see it, an investigation into possible crimes that emerged out, if any, if any, that emerged out of the relationship, if any, between the Trump campaign and Russian authorities. So at the end of the day, it could have been done better. Maybe it was done in haste, but I don't think it was a violation of DOJ regulations.
Gotcha. Another question here on another issue for you, and this is from member Hoyakon, a pseudonym. I think it's fairly well known that the Clintons personally went after Starr's investigators tooth and nail. I'd like to hear some confirmation of this and maybe some examples.
Yeah, clearly, it was blood sport. First of all, there were investigators. I can't say that I know exactly who hired them, who was responsible for them, who were investigating my personal life, including in Arkansas. Some allegations were made that were completely unfounded. There were also efforts to take out some of my prosecutors who were career people, looking up had they conducted themselves as prosecutors in their respective work, whether at the Public Integrity Section of the Justice Department or a U.S. Attorney's Office. And so it was pretty unsettling. It definitely unsettled one member, I'm not going to name that person's name, unsettled one of my colleagues who was extremely emotionally upset because there was a investigation into some background activity involving his personal life, not criminal activity, but embarrassing personally to that person. So, no, the Clintons played for keeps.
Apparently speaking, I mean, you know, in reading your book, there's, you know, obviously a lot of anecdotes in there. And you personally took a lot of incoming from the media as well. What was that like for you?
Well, it was pretty miserable because I was so frustrated that even though our investigation had been authorized, as we said earlier in the program, in the podcast, by Janet Reno, that wasn't coming through. We couldn't get the Justice Department to rally around us and say, listen, this is an investigation that we have personally authorized based on the evidence that we had before us, et cetera. So what I did was I encouraged my colleagues, both my fellow prosecutors and folks in the FBI in particular, try to shield yourself from all this outside noise. Our audience is in the courthouse. Our audience is not the mainstream media and even the American people, ultimately. Our audience has to be the judges and the jurors, including, during the Lewinsky phase of the investigation in particular, the grand jurors in Washington, D.C. So just think of the demographics and the politics of Washington, D.C. It stands to reason, we ask no questions, that the politics of the grand jurors serving in the Clinton investigation would have been pretty favorable and friendly toward both Bill and Hillary. But I will say this, those grand jurors, and I'm careful about what I say about the specifics of grand jurors, were very upstanding citizens, both races, men and women, and they were just truth seekers. And so I said to my colleagues, that's our audience.
Right.
It's the grand jurors. And let's not lose one iota of integrity and honor before them, regardless of what Geraldo and others are saying out in the media.
Yeah, yeah, you certainly make it apparent in the book. You commend the grand jury process and those people that do serve in not such a, it's a challenging environment for everybody. And we're going to get back after this, our last segment, a couple more Ricochet questions, and I want to talk a little bit about your perspective on what is currently happening right now with the Supreme Court. We'll be right back, last segment with Ken Starr. Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics and America's Voice News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click 5 stars on iTunes if you're listening to this audio podcast, and you can also find us at Ricochet. We're still with Ken Starr, who's talking about his book, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton administration, or investigation, I should say. We just went through an extremely traumatic chapter in American history, and that has to do with the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh, who I understand you worked with. First and foremost, just a kind of a 500-foot overview, your perspective of that chapter, what took place, and if you can introduce your relationship to Justice Kavanaugh.
Well, I thought that the process was extremely unfair, untidy. I'm so thankful for Senator Lindsey Graham making the points that he did, this reversal of a presumption of innocence, this without corroboration. I'm not going to say anything negative about Dr. Ford, the complainant, but there was no corroboration, whereas now Justice Kavanaugh, had all kinds of corroboration. So it wasn't standing up. It being the allegation was not standing up. It was simply being accepted, and I thought, unfortunately, for political purposes that affect the court. But the good news is Brett Kavanaugh survived, and you're right, I do know him well and have the highest regard for him. In fact, Dave, he not only served on the independent counsel staff, we also practiced law together for a while before he re-entered public service, but he was the principal architect of the death report of Vincent Foster Jr.
Yeah.
So he was very intimately involved in some of the most sensitive aspects. And I will say this, one of the reasons that I believe Brett Kavanaugh is I was around him day in and day out. And there were women colleagues. And that's one of the things that never happened in the course of our investigation, was a suggestion that Brett Kavanaugh was somehow behaving in a way toward anyone, but especially in this context toward women, in an inappropriate way. Not one hint, not one suggestion over years. And that's then true when he served for 12 years as a member of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, with many women law clerks, more women law clerks than most judges. And now, by the way, he has 4 women law clerks at the Supreme Court. So I think it was a very unhappy period in American history that I hope we can just close the door to that and now look at what Brett is doing, the Justice Kavanaugh is doing in the Supreme Court, and he's already doing a spectacular job, including his opinion very recently that was a unanimous opinion by the court. And by the way, one of the things that he was emphasizing is it's not our job to try to change or improve a statute passed by Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. It was a reminder of that which he was saying so eloquently during his confirmation hearings, that it's the job of the judges. We all know, as every one of your observers, listeners, viewers knows, it's the job of the judge to interpret the law, but not to make it all up. He's going to be a great justice.
When you took a look at what the process looked like, from a legal perspective, how chilling was the lack of due process, or throwing it out of the window for political? I guess the idea was that politics trump due process. Is that what you saw?
That's what I saw, that the stakes were viewed as very high on the Supreme Court because Justice Kavanaugh was to occupy Justice Kennedy's very important pivotal seat. And I think that made all the difference in the world. Compare, going back in time, the difference in the treatment between Antonin Scalia, who was unanimously confirmed, same sort of traditional, originalist, conservative philosophy, unanimously. And then 1 year later, what happens to Robert Bork? condemned, vilified. Look what happens to Clarence Thomas a couple of years later, etc. So the politics and importance of the seat being occupied will drive people, unfortunately, to do things that they should never have done nor allowed to happen. So I think it was a very shameful day for the Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee to jump unfairly to these conclusions and perhaps ruin someone's life as a result of accepting uncorroborated allegations.
Do you think we're going to see something similar when Justice Ginsburg retires, which could be imminently, from what I've been reading?
I think it's now all bets are off. What we used to call comity, respect for the nominee, whether you're going to vote in favor of him or her or not. I think, unfortunately, it's just brass knuckles politics. I think we can expect the worst.
Yeah, it's a shame. Another question here from Ricochet member Judge Mantle. Should low-level federal judges be allowed to question Trump's judgment on immigration, and should he defy their nationwide injunctions outside of the specific judge's jurisdiction? And by the way, that was a combination question also with Richard Easton.
Okay, good. Yeah, the first one is tough, because it obviously depends on what is the specific allegation being made, and then what's the request being, the relief that's being requested. But on the second question, no, I would say don't defy. That's inconsistent with our fundamental values of the rule of law. That's why we have a Court of Appeals, and ultimately why we have the Supreme Court of the United States. So when we go back to the early immigration bans that the president imposed in the very early days of his presidency, ultimately the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the travel ban in the Hawaii case. So that's our system, and we need to abide by it.
Okay. Okay. Going back to Justice Kavanaugh real quickly, have you spoken with him since? Obviously, you've got a close relationship. Have you spoken with him since the whole hullabaloo, and how is he doing?
I saw him in late October. We had one of our occasional reunions of the independent counsel's office. Saw him and his spouse. They're doing fine. And in fact, I heard a very cute story about the justice being with his two beautiful daughters going around trick-or-treating on Halloween night. I've not spoken to him since late October, but everything that I hear is it's steady as she goes, and the family is doing just fine.
Boy, you got to have some real thick skin to go through that. I couldn't imagine. I mean,
it's tough. It's very tough.
Yeah, yeah.
So I used the term earlier, blood sport, and that was what Vince Foster Jr., who committed suicide, referred to. And James Stewart, the Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote a book entitled Blood Sport. Washington.
I did read that. I read that, I think it was in the 90s, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so real quickly, because you brought up Vince Foster twice, and there's been so much innuendo and rumor, and with the internet, everything is just so crazy. He committed suicide, right? Is that what?
There's no question.
Okay, there's no question. But a lot of people have reported that he committed suicide by, and maybe you can correct this, by shooting himself in the back of the head 3 times.
No. A single bullet. We know exactly what he did, pretty much when he did it. One of the key points that the conspiracy theorists said, well, no blood was found at the site, so his body must have been moved and so forth. But if you read the Brett Kavanaugh report, if you like Brett Kavanaugh, then read the report, which obviously I'm responsible for, but he was the principal architect of the report. It's over 100 pages. It's available on the internet. And I think a fair-minded reader will say, given this evidence, there's not even a reasonable doubt. There can be no human doubt whatsoever that Vince, who was suffering from clinical depression and who was under medication, took his own life. I have said that, and one of the things that I've said right in the book is, why did he take his life? That's the real question. And I think that points, frankly, to the circumstances he found himself in the Clinton White House.
Yeah, and it's one of those stories that's going to be discussed for years, but you go deep web and that gets pretty scary. A lot of tinfoil hat stuff going on out there about that. So,
Yes.
well, fantastic. I greatly appreciate you taking the time, Ken, and thank you again for joining us. It's been a couple of years. Last question for you before we sign off here. Do you have trust? Do you have faith? Are you optimistic about our judicial system after what you've seen the last couple of years?
Oh, yes. No, the judges, in fact, one of the great things I saw, the very first case argued, and Judge Kavanaugh had not become Justice Kavanaugh, involved the Endangered Species Act. And it looked from the oral argument, I follow what the court is doing, as if, oh, no, the court's going to be split in 9 justices, there'll be 3 or 4 opinions, and 5 to 4. It was a unanimous opinion, and upholding the right of the property holders to say, the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to take a very careful look at what they've done in terms of saying this habitat, you cannot have real estate development. So you might say, oh, this is just business against the environmentalists. On the court, I'm talking about. The court was unanimous in saying that the government had gone too far, needs to take a second look at this. But here's my point. The court heard argument. If you read the transcript, you would say they're going to be all over the lot. They weren't. They went into the conference room and came out with unanimity. So the Supreme Court's working great.
Ken Starr, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Folks, find it. We'll put a link up here with this episode. Greatly appreciate you taking the time, sir. It's been an honor, and I wish you the best of luck with the book and everything else out there. Thank you so much for joining us. And folks, you can continue to find us at America's Voice News, YouTube, Ricochet, all of your podcast applications. Signing off for now, Dave Sussman, Whiskey Politics. Again, a very special thanks to Ken Starr. Cheers.